Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door for Nintendo Switch is a faithful and beautiful remake or remaster of the original GameCube classic. The game is neatly structured into 8 memorable chapters, and after beating the final boss, I found myself trying to decide on a favorite. So I decided to sit down and just rank all the chapters based on the combination of various factors, such as pure enjoyment, art and level design, story beats, gameplay mechanics, and more. Please remember to subscribe to support the channel for more Nintendo and other gaming analysis, really trying to reach that 1,000 subscriber milestone, and leave a comment with your own personal chapter rankings. Let's dive in. Also, beware that there are spoilers ahead for all 8 chapters, obviously. So rounding out the bottom here, last on the list at number 8, we have Chapter 2, The Great Boggly Tree, which is undoubtedly the least fun chapter in the game, and unfortunately comes pretty early on. In this chapter, you're tasked with helping the Punies, who were captured by the X-Nauts when the villains invaded their great tree. This chapter starts out somewhat interesting, with the adorable Punio character, a unique color palette for the forest, and a tonal shift from the previous chapter. However, it quickly becomes a bit of a slog with a lot of backtracking and an overly long second half that involves traveling up and down the interior of the Labyrinth Great Tree, the interior of which is probably the least interesting environment in the game. Flurry is also possibly the most forgettable companion character in the game. Although there is a somewhat rewarding overall narrative arc to this chapter, it's a bit of a chore to get there. At number 7, we have Chapter 4, For Pigs the Bell Tolls. In this chapter, Mario is tasked with rescuing a village that is under a curse that turns people into pigs from a monster who lives in a haunted steeple nearby. I think I actually enjoyed this chapter a little bit more than most people seem to, with its dark humor and offbeat storyline, but it can still feel underwhelming compared to the other parts of the game. Visually, this chapter has sort of a dreary aesthetic, which matches the tone of the story and Twilight Town well, but can also feel a little bit dull compared to the other chapters. The haunted steeple is definitely the highlight of the chapter, and Vivian is an interesting companion. This chapter again suffers from a lot of backtracking and perhaps another overly long segment where you play as Shadow Mario, but it's at least more interesting than the Boggly Woods chapter. Number 6 on this list is Chapter 1, Castle and Dragon. There's honestly nothing really wrong with this chapter, it's just not quite as interesting as those higher on the list. This chapter is sort of a classic story of fighting your way to a dragon in a castle, with a semi-interesting companion out to prove himself. Visually, the greenery around the castle and the fortress itself are both appealing and serve as proper introductions to the various systems of the game and how things will play out. There's also an interesting hook where you have to find a hidden item to weaken the boss in your inevitable confrontation, and a satisfying conclusion to the story. Number 5 on the list is Of Glitz and Glory. This chapter is one of the most unique and memorable in the game. Mario must fight his way to the top of the Glitz Pit to obtain a crystal star, and naturally gets caught up in political intrigue and conflicts along the way. This whole chapter plays out as a series of arena battles, with story developments in between different fights. The plot keeps you guessing to some extent, and has plenty of memorable characters and locales. The Yoshi companion is also a great character. Even the setup ahead of this chapter, infiltrating the Pianta mob to obtain a blimp ticket, it's all pretty entertaining. However, this chapter does have some major pacing issues, and sometimes slows to a crawl as you battle through all 17 levels of the arena. Some streamlining here definitely could have helped. This chapter also has noticeably more dialogue than gameplay relative to the other chapters. It can feel like you're watching it play out rather than actually playing it. For number 4, we have Chapter 8, The Thousand-Year Door, the final chapter in the game. Without getting too far into spoilers, this chapter nicely wraps up a variety of plot points and plays to the strengths of the characters and relationships you discover along the way. The locales and boss fights feel appropriately epic, even if some of the puzzle elements are a bit weak or bland compared to the other chapters. The main reason this chapter doesn't rank higher is that the level design or actual gameplay scenarios aren't as memorable or as unique as other chapters. This one really leans heavily into aesthetic, boss fights, and story beats, which is certainly appropriate for a final chapter. Overall, it's a satisfying conclusion. Alright, so we're in the top 3 now. In third place, we have Chapter 7, Mario Shoots to the Moon. In this chapter, Mario literally launches himself to the moon in an attempt to save Peach and obtain another crystal star. This is a unique chapter that really captures a great combination of interesting locales, story beats, gameplay, and a handful of surprises. From the mega cannon powered by endless bob-ombs, which is probably my personal favorite scene in the game, to the low-gravity beauty of the moon, to the fortress infiltration, this is one of the most interesting and diverse chapters in the game. There's also a surprisingly emotional conclusion that really pays off this late in the story, and in some ways Chapter 7 feels like part 1 of the full ending, since the final chapter starts almost immediately after you're back on Earth. In second place, we have Chapter 5, The Key to Pirates. This chapter finds Mario on a seafaring pirate adventure to an uncharted island, complete with massive treasures, centuries-old curses, shipwrecks, and more. Chapter 5 captures a grand sense of adventure that unfolds over interesting locations and story beats. Whether being attacked by ghosts and washing up on uncharted shores, investigating deep caves full of treasure, fighting the ghosts of legendary pirates, or engaging in epic sea battles, this chapter really has it all. The visual presentation in the remake is stellar and memorable. All in all, it's one of the most memorable chapters in the game. And finally, in first place, the winner is Chapter 6, 3 Days of Excess, which is perhaps the most unique and creative chapter in the game. This chapter invokes classic mystery film or novel tropes aboard a luxurious train headed for the wealthy town of Boggly Heights, where one of the crystal stars resides. Mario finds himself as the sidekick of a detective trying to solve various issues on the train, including a threat against Mario himself, and you'll have to do some sleuthing to find the answers. This game uses clever character dialogue, clues, and puzzle solving to guide you through 3 days on the train. The train itself is rendered beautifully in the remake, with lighting changes depending on the time of day, subtle animation work, and clever attention to details. There's also a stop at a station where the train bridges out, which provides a clever and much-needed change of scenery during the middle of the 3 days. Here is where you'll find pretty much the only combat or platforming in this chapter, but everything about it is memorable and clever. After a wild boss fight, the chapter culminates in a brief stop at the beautiful Boggly Heights. The writing and character interactions are all top-notch from start to finish. When I played this chapter for the first time, I initially thought the setup would prove to be boring, but I instantly became hooked and enjoyed it till the very end. So that's my list. What did you think? How would you order these chapters? Please remember to hit subscribe, leave a comment, and let's discuss.